Hey guys, I want to share with you a common issue that I find with a lot of borrowers. Their question is, how come I can't buy low, put high rehab into it, and sell for even higher? The deal makes a lot of sense. So I thought it might be helpful to help break this down for you guys on the whiteboard so that you understand why from a lending standpoint this doesn't make sense. So what we're really talking about is the low purchase price, high rehab, and why this doesn't make sense from a lending standpoint. Now, I want you to understand when I write these numbers, you're going to be like, oh, that makes sense all day. Initially, you're going to say, okay, 50 grand purchase price with, I don't know, 100 grand rehab. And an exit or after repair value of, let's switch these around. ARV goes down here. And let's say 300. Now this makes sense all day, right? 50, 100 to 300. That means I'm in for 50%. That's a great deal. Why wouldn't I lend on that? Well, let me explain why. Why this doesn't work from a lending standpoint. It's as simple as equity. And what do I mean by that? Let's talk about the loan. Let's say that I gave you 100% of everything. Let's just say, hey, you're a great borrower. I like you. I like working with you. I'm going to give you 100%. So for the purpose of this conversation, let's use that as a scenario. I give you 50 grand to buy the property. What's the very first thing that you're going to do with a $100,000 rehab? Well, let's talk about that. 100 grand rehab, you're probably opening walls. You're probably doing landscaping. You're probably doing HVAC. Maybe some foundation issues, right? Maybe you're beefing up the foundation because you're going up vertical. Maybe you're beefing up the foundation because you're going out. You're probably adding some square footage with 100 grand rehab to yield a $300,000 ARV. So the reality is the first week of this rehab, you're probably spending, I don't know, let's say 25 grand. Well, let's say maybe even a little bit more, right? You're spending, let's say, in the first 2 weeks, you're going to spend 30 grand. Let's just put it that way. Between material, between demo, between maybe some starting landscaping, there's a number of things that you could be doing, but let's say on this, in the first 2 weeks or even the first month, let's say the first 2 weeks, I would say you could probably eat into 30 grand pretty quickly. So from a lending standpoint, in the first 2 weeks, I've given you 50 grand. Remember, I've given you 50 grand and I've given you 100 grand. This is the lender, right? So in the first 2 weeks, I've given you 80 grand. $80,000. Now, I want you to notice something. How close are we to getting to this? Well, we still got, quite a ways to get from here to here, right? The timeline is a ways out, right? So there's a factor here that's called time that we also have to take in consideration, because a $100,000 rehab takes a whole lot longer than a small rehab, or at least theoretically it should, right? So there's another factor here, which is time. And the time also has an effect on the ARV. The longer it takes me to get to this, the more that this number can change, right? My ARV, a year out, think of that. We're basing our today's after repair value on yesterday's sales, or hopefully today's, but it's very rare that we find a comp that sold for today for 300. It was probably yesterday's, last week's, last month's, hopefully in the last 6 months. So we're expecting to come up with tomorrow's future, or in this case, a $100,000 rehab. You're probably looking at 6 months to a year down the road based on information from 6 months ago, last week, last month. So this time really has an effect on it. The longer it takes me to get to that, in other words, the bigger the rehab, the more risky it is from a lending standpoint, just because this could change. But regardless of that factor, let's talk more about this. What happens here is I give you 50 grand towards the purchase. I've given you 30 grand in the first few weeks to get started, and I'm all in at 80 grand. Well, let's talk about real life scenarios. What happens if the contractor skips town, gets sick, family emergency, has something going on in his life, because this has happened to me, where he can't finish the rehab. Now you're scrambling, trying to find someone else that could do this rehab. Or heaven forbid something happens to you. You skip town, you've got a family emergency in Canada that you gotta go attend to. You gotta go away. Now for whatever reason, you can't finish this, contractor, you, somebody else, I'm left with a house that, let's be honest, if you start $30,000 rehab on a $50,000 house, this value is going down. You start opening up walls, you start doing demo, you start ripping up the garage, the yard, everything else. The value of this house after you've invested 30 grand, or actually after I've invested 30 grand, isn't 50 grand anymore. It didn't go up, it actually went down. So let's say this thing's now worth 30, right? So really, I've invested 80 grand on a house that's only worth 30. I can't get this money back, it's already spent. I've got $30,000 in equity on a property that's inhabitable. I can't rent it out. I don't want to finish it because it's a long ways to get to ARV between time, money, and quite frankly, I'm a lender, not a flipper. I have no desire to be out on the job site taking care of what you guys should be, what you agreed to. So I've got 80 grand in a deal. Imagine if I gave you all 100 up front. I would have been really hosed, right? But at least I'm smart enough to only give you draws as they're needed. So I've got 80 grand into a deal that I could maybe get 30 grand for. So I've just inherited a $50,000 loss. So this is why this deal does not make sense from a lending standpoint and why it's a very risky loan. The equity, once again, is what I was talking about at the beginning. It doesn't make sense because now it could go terribly wrong. And the time, right? There's a lot that needs to get done on a $100,000 rehab to get me to the finish line, as opposed to, let's say this was the 100,000, this was the 50, right? This timeline just got a whole lot shorter, and the numbers are exactly the same, but this deal makes a whole lot more sense because your time is cut in half. Basically, this time is just cut in half. Your rehab, let's say that I keep the numbers the same, or this rehab actually on the first couple weeks, let's say I'm gonna do, I don't know, 15 grand. Let's see how this has an effect